Claflin, which is one of the top HBCUs in the country, it's in Orangeburg, South Carolina, 89% of the kids are underprepared for college. So what these public schools are doing is they're setting them up to fail. Now, because it is our mission, we are a black school, we're going to help those students. We're not going to give up on them. They can go to a large PWI and flunk out within a year. And they don't care because they can just get a new crop in. But because it's more of our mission, we are a black school for black kids. It's our history, it goes back to 1869. We take on the dual challenge to help close the gaps created by the system of this inadequate public school system, as well as to teach them everything they need to know so that they're up to speed and graduate within 4 to 5 years. And HBCUs produce the black middle class. Not all the blacks who are at these PWIs. So that's very, very interesting because in that black space, so there are times when I'm assigning them a lot to read and they want to, huff and puff, and so Dr. Brogna will get up and I'll close the door and I can have a conversation about the history of racism in that space that I may not be able to have at a white school. And so after I reopen the door, there's a lot more energy around reading that book when I kind of tell them about pejorative beliefs about if you want to hide anything from a black person, what's the saying? Put it in the book. Oh, I never heard that. And so when they start learning about this history and beliefs about that we're not as intelligent as others, and the great lengths our ancestors went. It was against the law for them to be literate. But they went to great lengths to learn how to read. They were not ignorant, they spoke other languages. They just were not allowed to speak English. But they went to those great lengths to educate themselves. And as soon as they were free, they start building schools, colleges, and universities. I don't ever want to hear you tell me you don't want to read a book. I've never had a group of black kids that ever was like, I don't like that, Dr. Brogna. My students love me. All right, and so they want that. They just don't understand that history and why it's important for them. And so these black schools are experiencing a bit of a resurgence because we are doing some of that hard internal work with them. So that's a great assessment. So I'm gonna get started. Probably spend, because we've just had such a rich time together. Probably spend 35 minutes on these slides. I have a couple handouts I want to share. We'll talk a little bit more and we'll call it a break, because I'll be back in May, and we can continue this conversation. Orlando. Yeah. A little bit down the road there. Good. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward. We're gonna bring a group. So we're looking forward to it. This book right here. Where do we go from here? If you don't have a copy of it, you're gonna buy a copy after this workshop. And at the May meeting, we are going to spend some time with this book. Because it's a book that is really paradigmatic and prophetic for America. Not just 1968, but it pretty much sets the template for what is going to unfold in America in the following decades. He sees America's future revolving around 4 issues: economic inequality. And when we talk about economic inequality, the legacy of slavery is black poverty. When you see masses of black Americans, and don't let Oprah and Barack Obama and these athletes fool you. The black community has no wealth. We are 13.4% of the U.S. population. We own 2.6% of the wealth. The white Americans are 60.4% of the U.S. population. They own 90% of the the wealth. We don't own the wealth that is commensurate with the percentages we have in this country. In fact, we have the same amount of wealth in 2022 that we had in 1865 when we left slavery. And by 2050, the black community will have zero wealth. So it's not about income. Wealth is what you pass on, and we have none. We have $5.04 in wealth for every $100 a white family has in wealth. So the black community is a wealth poor, wealth deficit community, and King saw that. But poverty is also an American problem I'm going to get into and explore. And this is why your assessment of race must also involve looking at both class and gender. Because the issue of poverty is very, very complex, and King saw that. King saw that disorganized black power was going to be a problem. Boy, was he spot on. It's continuing to play itself out, that you always have black groups really fighting against themselves. And when they were talking about black power, 67, 68, 69, and of course in the 70s, today we're talking about Black Lives Matter. And they're both very, very controversial, very contested. But what it's about is how do we leverage our own power and our own influence. King talks about the white resistance to justice and equality, and then the problem of social instability and chaos. Guess what happened in America? Economic inequality, disorganized black power, white resistance, social chaos. So let's have a little context on King writing this book. There's so much swirling around Dr. King when he pulls away from his intense schedule, spends some time down in the Caribbean writing this book. He has spoken out against the Vietnam War. His approval rating is at an all-time low. Most Americans were very, very critical, not to mention the fact that the FBI, classified him as, one of the most dangerous men in America. A lot of people hated Dr. King. And when King shifted, it's one thing when he was talking about voting rights and, integration. But once he started to get at the heart of the American crisis, which is structural inequality, structural injustice, and he started trying to challenge the country to reimagine its social life, he was met with massive resistance on the right and the left. So King goes to Chicago. He's shifted his work. He's doing, focusing on the Poor People's Campaign, was organizing another march on Washington. And I'll show this clip when we reconvene in Orlando, where King basically argues, next time we come to Washington, we're coming to get our check. He's talking about reparations. What's an interesting juxtaposition is Malcolm X, who starts out so radical, actually moves in his life and becomes this sort of universalist. So universalist that he falls out with the Nation of Islam once he has a bigger picture of Islam, one that's beyond the black-white binary that was functioning in these urban centers across the country. King, who starts out on the other opposite end of the spectrum, we must love our white sisters and brothers. By the end, King says we need temporary segregation until we're ready for integration that's real. So in a sense, they kind of go in opposite directions. But you wouldn't know that from how, when people think of Malcolm X, they think of early Malcolm X. They don't understand how he evolved in his thinking And when they think of Dr. King, they think of just I Have a Dream speech. They don't know anything else. They don't know just how radical King was in those latter years. There's a reason folks hated him, because he was pushing. Because you have grinding poverty, disillusionment, and pessimism about leaders on both sides and how much change they're committed to. Police brutality is a problem. What's new? All this stuff constantly was leading to rioting in the streets. So whether it's Chicago, whether it's his work in Memphis, this is a hot time. Gates' African-American history text just frames this as a time where there are riots everywhere. You know how worked up people were when there were riots because of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. And they were acting as if, for the first time in American history, our cities are on fire. And it's like, do you not know? This is regular. This stuff happens all the time. And in '67, look at, oh, did somebody? Well, it couldn't have been, because when the Trayvon Martin verdict went down, what happened? When Ferguson happened, like, it's America. These things keep happening. It's just, they just get in this state of mind that there's something so different when it's the same thing. Rodney King in the 90s. And so there's just riots going on everywhere in '67. So even the folks with gray heads knew this, but then today they were acting as if what's happening in Louisville and Minneapolis it's like, no, it's been going on. So he writes this book. It's published in '68, and these are the chapter essays. It's just always kind of good to see how he structures his book, and boy, the first chapter is good. What I want to do is share so just so that you've got some quotes that, because I know you can't wait to get the book. So, but before you get the book, there are just some great quotes. And I mean, what he talks about in the first chapter is just, especially if you want to understand, when he's talking about where we are, he gives voice. He clearly articulates his dismay as we move to what he calls the second phase of the civil rights movement. And every time, when he's expecting progress, he's expecting to get cooperation from Christian leaders, particularly from white Christian leaders, and he's just constantly met with disappointment. Now, in the first phase of the civil rights movement, dealing with integration, voting rights, etc., he found that he had white allies, but when it was time to get down to these deeper, hard issues, he was met with such resistance. So if you look at those quotes from the first chapter, would someone like to read any one of those that jump out to you? Because, I mean, he's got some doozies in there. I mean, those are some softballs, you know. Anyone under the first chapter that just sort of stands out in your mind? Equality? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so he's writing this to kind of, because people were trying to put out ads in the newspaper arguing that the civil rights movement is dead. And so, as one of the chief architects and organizers of this movement, he wanted to give an assessment of, where is the movement? And so, it's not that it's stalled, it is being met with widespread resistance as it tries to forge ahead and push forward. That if you're going to fix the problem, you have to do it at the structural level. And he found that white progressives were okay and they were on board with the movement when it was dealing with, because when I describe racism, there are two, and it's the same for slavery. It's two things. It's dehumanization and it's economic exploitation. If you want to understand slavery, if you want to understand racism, there is that dehumanizes. Black people are less intelligent. Black people cannot control themselves sexually. That's another sort of pejorative racist belief. Black people do not contribute to human civilization. So you challenge that by showing all the inventions, that the idea of a university library, an idea of a university, all these things can be traced to the continent of Africa. We're just as intelligent as all our other sisters and brothers in the human family. But too many people think, when they think of racism, they just think of the dehumanization, lynching, beating slaves with the lash. But no, slavery was really about making people rich and using free and cheap labor to make select people rich. And if you're going to fix the legacy of slavery, you must deal with it at the level of dehumanization, but also you must address the legacy of economic exploitation. And once you want to start talking about money, because slavery is about the money. All the founding fathers, except Adams, they were all slave owners. And they leveraged the number of slaves they had. They leveraged that to become very wealthy men. And to be the very people writing the Constitution, our founding documents. So the fact that they was able to use the wealth generated by owning slaves, they end up writing the form of government that we have in this country. Inequality is baked into the cake. And so once you start challenging our white sisters and brothers that the deeper problems is more than just getting people to stop saying the N-word and to think that they're not better than someone because of the color of their skin. But we've got a lot of other things to fix. At the same time, the federal government says we're not going to give freed slaves 40 acres and a mule, but we are going to give white Americans the Homestead Act. We're going to give them millions and millions of acres of land for free. And we're not going to give this to black people. And you can trace, a study was done that there are over 46 million white families today who can trace their history of home ownership and wealth to a specific policy of the federal government that was racist. Because if a policy from the federal government benefits one group, disadvantages another group, that's what you call a racist policy. How do you fix a racist policy? Well, you have to fix that with a new policy. And if you proposed a Homestead Act today that would give African Americans land, it would be pandemonium. You're giving them handouts. You got handouts. you got handouts. And so when you start having to address these deeper structural problems, even white progressives start to sound and look very, very conservative. So this is a great book. King, he issues a devastating warning in this text that if we're not committed and go back to thinking about those three great evils of American society: racism, poverty, militarism. He warns, you build a country where a few people are going to thrive, and you're going to leave masses of people disenfranchised. I'm telling you, that country is going to collapse. If you study human history, okay, there's a book by Matthew Ashimolo called Why Nations Fail. Anyone who's done history of different empires and different kingdoms, they'll tell you the formula. But we somehow think we are exempt. You cannot keep people locked out of wealth, health, and happiness. We're either going to share the blessings of what gets produced, or folks are going to overthrow these things. Look at what happened to our capital last January. Yeah. No, 13.4. Yeah. Yes, you got 60% white, 13.4% black, and then yeah. 60, yeah. And the Hispanics, they've passed us. Yeah. 2050 will be zero wealth. 6. Yep. Because we don't own anything, and because the downside of integration, and this is some of what fed King's, I think, some of the depression, is his earlier work paved the way for whites who were not well-meaning to end up benefiting in ways he probably did not foresee. Because think about during segregation, we owned our own banks, we had our own sports leagues, we had our own insurance organizations, we had our own schools, our own churches, our own forms of press. And even though these things like the Tulsa attack, where you get Black Wall Street just completely destroyed, we had these entities. Now we think just because LeBron James can make $30-something million a year to play basketball, he's still not the Buss family. He doesn't own the Lakers. And during segregation, we own those things. So integration never meant whites and blacks integrating at every level. It meant we gave up everything for only a small percentage of blacks to come into white space. It left the masses of blacks with no institutions and no wealth. And so we're seeing the black community just completely collapsing on itself, because Cornel West would have been at an HBCU. He's at an Ivy League school. So the best of the black community doesn't work in black spaces and black communities. They work in white communities. So this is why he started arguing, wait, whoa. No, they don't want to do integration right. We need to go back to temporarily segregate until we do integration the right way. But it was too, the die had been cast. And so you get some of what you're seeing, a community that in 100-something years has accumulated no wealth because we don't own anything. We have the buying power of the 89th largest country in the world, but where does it get us when you don't own anything? He argued we need a revolution of values because he's arguing for the country to do some real hard work, and it would have been easier if America had done that stuff in the 60s than to be trying to do it today in the age of technology. But we just keep kicking the can down the street saying, well, let them try to figure it all out. The problem is you keep delaying fixing these structural issues, the country is going to implode on itself. He says, without a spiritual and moral reawakening, not a bunch of church services. When you talk revival, that's all, you know, if people are in the evangelical strain, we think, oh, we're going to get together and have some church. We're going to cry and pour our heart out to God. Okay, yes, I'm all for that. If it means we build a better world, not just have powerful worship. He says we're going to destroy ourselves. And after Pentecostalism has exploded all over the country, it has never translated itself into a moral movement like we had in the civil rights movement. So in the foreword, Coretta writes in a way that, because if you read Coretta's autobiography, you see she is an equal partner in every sense of the word with Dr. King. He was constantly bouncing ideas off of her. She was an intellectual partner with him. So she talks about here, he discusses poverty as the source of world instability and the arrogance of wealthy nations. But this middle quote where it says, it is our common tragedy that we have lost his prophetic voice, but it would compound the tragedy if the lessons he did articulate are now ignored. The solutions he offered can still save our society from self-destruction, which is why part of my passion is telling people, read Dr. King. If you want to make a difference in the public square, you want to help build a better world, there are people who have been doing this work before us, who have paved the way, and they provide a powerful lens. So I believe what King was saying is if we don't address these problems, America is going to fracture. And America did not listen. We had we moved into the era of mass incarceration. So we go from Jim Crow to the era of mass incarceration, the era of the super rich. Every decade since the 60s, there's been a recession and growing poverty. It's just a cycle that continues. And now with the extreme wealth of the technocrats, the Buffetts, the folks running all these social media and tech empires, the amount of wealth they yield. We call ourselves a democracy. We are really an oligarchy. We are ruled by the rich. And if you kind of go back to the Middle Ages and look at how because there's just a tremendous amount of research being done by folks in political science, economists and historians, that the way the super rich control even our form of government. We're only a democracy in name only. The way we disenfranchise the electorate, whether it's robbing them of their voting rights or making them believe the system is so rigged that there's no need for them to waste their time voting, which you have a huge block of Americans who most elections they check out. Now, we had a record voter turnout in the last presidential election. Is that going to be a trend or is that going to be an anomaly? I fear it's going to be an anomaly because among advanced democracies, we rank in the low 20s in voter turnout. In fact, poverty is such a problem in this country today that the United Nations commissioned a special study in 2018. The UN came to America, not Rwanda, not somewhere in India or South America, but to study poverty in America. And it found that about 40 million people in this country are living in poverty. 18.5 in extreme poverty. 5.3 million people in America are living in third world conditions of absolute poverty. We don't see it because we're insulated and isolated from it. But it's happening. There is bone deep poverty in this country, and we should be ashamed. There should not be a pulpit in the country that's not talking about it. So I preached this sermon using the story of the Good Samaritan. And the sermon is opening our eyes to human suffering. And when I get to the end of the sermon, because these are our neighbors, people who are homeless, people who are in prison, people who are in these refugee camps, they're our neighbors. In the Matthew 25 passage, that's Jesus in a refugee camp with no clothes. And you know how that story goes. We're either giving Jesus something to drink, clothes, we're picking up the phone and we're calling our congressman. We're doing something to make sure Jesus is not left in the tent, but we don't see Jesus. We don't see the person in that camp, that poor person under the bridge. We don't see them as our neighbor. And so I've been challenging pastors in churches to start putting up images of these people in your homes, in your churches. Put the billboards up, put those images up on your social media page. Put it in our face. Don't let us hide from it. Jimmy Carter talked about, and it's a little dated, the quote, "We've only been at peace 16 of our 242 years as a nation." He argues we are the most warlike nation in the history of the world. But that's not the narrative we tell about ourselves. But we cannot stop. And besides World War I and II, every war is waged somewhere where there are brown people. This is a comment you mentioned, but this is the event that changed America. Obama becoming the President of the United States, 44th. Many initially thought we were in a post-racial era, but boy, were we wrong. Whether it was the Tea Party that came on the scenes claiming they're going to take their country back, to eventually the MAGA movement of making America great, we saw this explosion of white nationalism and a resurgence in overt racism that manifested itself in acts of racial violence. An attack on our Capitol. Now, yeah, and what has unfolded has been just unfathomable, and I just don't know if we really have perspective. It's almost become normal, which just shows you how dangerous evil is. Because when evil just kind of ingrains itself and people start thinking it's normal, then good people just start doing evil things, and there's nothing to pull them back. So this is why our work is so important, because we are in an era of great social upheaval and deep social rifts. the pandemic was the thing that just exacerbated it and exposed deep, deep problems we had already had in this country, whether it's a political system that is very dysfunctional, xenophobia at the deepest levels of who we are. So there's no way of talking about the war on terror without understanding our history of racism and xenophobia. The pandemic exposed just how weak our infrastructure is in this country, and folks on both sides of the aisle, there's plenty of blame. Obama did a lot to weaken the infrastructure of this country. We couldn't even get mail effectively delivered because we've had administrations not investing in our infrastructure. But we do have drones and we've got bombs. Yes, we have that. But in other countries, you can go and get on a train, and not a raggedy train, very modern, sophisticated, high-speed train, and move across the country. Can you do that here? No. We don't really have the infrastructure. We don't invest in that. Some of that's because of, our worship of the big car companies. But you see the environmental fallout for that. So if you look deeper, what has unfolded in this country, King was talking about: systemic oppression, widespread suffering, especially connected to poverty. And the way Trump is valorized, I can understand it, because you have so many white Americans, they feel they've lost their country. But the reality is they're not enjoying their piece of the American dream. They're struggling with poverty, and they're looking for someone to blame it on, and someone to tell them, you know what the real problem is, even though that's not the problem. It just helps satiate their conscience and how they feel. It's mind-blowing. The 5 poorest states in this country they're Republican. And when he proposed a radical piece of legislation that would lift black and white Americans out of poverty, the system, they wouldn't push it through. And so the Democrats hadn't done themselves any favors. We own all 3 branches, can't get stuff through. So, yeah. So this is why you're going to probably get folks who are going to say, I'm not voting. And you know what's on the horizon. So when you revisit Dr. King's 3 great evils, this intersects with some of my work on nihilism. There is this undercurrent of hopelessness, meaninglessness, and lovelessness that's running rampant in our communities and in our streets. So when we talk about the power of love, you better have some teeth and some content to how you understand that. Because when you get masses of people who don't feel there's much to be hopeful about, that they're grappling to make sense of all that's happening, they will tear the country apart. They'll tear it down. They'll burn it down. You know you're burning down your own house. You don't think rationally so this undercurrent of nihilism where is very much a part of the crisis that has unfolded, what Dr. King foresaw when he argued, where do we go? Are we going to build community, or are we going to have chaos? We are seeing chaos unfolding. And so you do need to know, 2022, ministry has changed. I've been a student of trends in religion and American Christianity for And so this is a distillation of a couple decades of work from various resources that are talking about what's going on, what has changed. So when I say ministry has changed, it's because of these trends you see here on this sheet. And so the question is, how can churches lead the way? You have to understand the nature of preaching today is different. Pastoral leadership is different. Congregational life is different. Technology and worship, Christian education, credibility and integrity as it relates to both churches and leaders, they've all changed. So a few suggestions, and then I'm going to share a little bit about my work as I close. I tell my students and fellow clergy all the time, because I do get the wonderful privilege to not only teach in the classroom, but I get to do this all across the country, especially with MBCA churches. Lecture preaching is ineffective. In other words, talking at people does not work anymore. People don't want you talking at them. But a style of preaching where they are feeling you are speaking from a place of authenticity and honesty, that does speak to people still. Being overly defensive to critiques against the church, I don't think you're going to serve yourself well. You don't need to defend the church. There's too much out there on our checkered history. We are imperfect people. And so learning how to just admit the church has made mistakes, that we are still making mistakes, but then it doesn't have to mean God does not exist. Some people think, well, once the church makes a mistake, then God can't exist. How do you help people to understand that can happen, but it also does not mean God does not resist, or God is not real, or that faith is not real? It's hard to do that when you're being defensive versus when you can listen to people. And this is what helps, because I'm a professor, so sometimes people think once they shoot their shot, they tell you something, they got the goods on God or the church, and they tell you something and you don't go, oh my gosh, really? But you're like, well, yes, that's true. And thank you for sharing that. And then can give a thoughtful response. Man, that's just kind of like new to some folks. It's like God's big enough to hear this. If God's omniscient, I believe God is omniscient. God's not shaking on the throne because we're thinking. Okay, so that's all a part of the process of deepening your faith. And so I've been encouraging a lot of pastors to imagine what it would mean, because I think if you're trying to hold on to this congregational centric model, and I'm not saying congregations are going away. No, they're important. They're just one of many centers of faith in our communities. And learning how to see ourselves in a collegial, in partnership with nonprofits, educational institutions, parachurch organizations, I think this is the path to the revitalization of American Christianity. Thinking about what does it mean to focus on God's world. And if we focus on God's world and we're faithful to the gospel, I think God's going to help us with our congregations, our churches. Our churches are going to be fine. But leaving the world to the forces of evil and chaos, we can't do that. And if we're going to make a choice, I'm telling you, the choice is going to be focus on God's world. So sometimes you've got organizations that start within a church, and then they go out in the community, or they're a Christian organization building homes in the community, feeding programs. So it's not a congregation, but it's a Christian organization. But sometimes those organizations have started within a church and then and then go out into the community. And so any model that doesn't see them as in an antagonistic, it's not a rivalry. Now, pastors can be a bit territorial, and this is what's going to be new to them, especially in the black community, because the black church has been the center of so much in the black community. But, you know, Eddie Glaude's article years ago where he says the black church is dead, he wasn't arguing the black church ceased to exist. He was saying this model of the church that's the center of everything in the black community, he said those days are over. Because Black Lives Matter was not a movement of the church. A lot of churches were not socially engaged. So there are people outside black churches who are doing King's work. And instead of us saying it's us against them, it's realizing there's room for everybody. Yeah, yeah. Just like they did the civil rights movement. Yep, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and then they'll try to make Black Lives Matter the same as an organization. It's like, no. The organization and Black Lives Matter as a movement, they're different. The organization is a part of this larger movement. And so, you know, I always push back on my white sisters and brothers. You can't define everything. You know, I know y'all used to it, but what you say does not mean that's necessarily true, and that we are going to subscribe to that form of thinking. So I'm going to push for Black Lives Matter aside from the organization, because the civil rights movement was bigger than King. Yeah, there was way more people in the movement than just Dr. King. So yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That one. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Because if those were masses of black people, the police response would have been, police response would have been different. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And it's God revealing. Yeah. This country is being exposed. Absolutely. Yeah. Just so that we all know what we're working with. There's no need to even worry about hiding it. So for those of you who are part of the preaching craft, at the end of my book, I talked about a model of ministry that's helpful for preaching, and then I've since elaborated on it in lectures I have done. I argue for this threefold model of preaching because there is a debate in the black church that some of what has fed the decline has been that black churches they're just socially irrelevant. And I've tried to develop a model that will help black pastors to to attend to the complex dimensions of preaching and ministry. And so in my motto, I argue the best of black preaching does three things. It attends to the pastoral, to the priestly, and to the prophetic. In pastoral preaching, you are attending to the care and instruction of God. This is I've pastored before as well as been an academic. So this is my way of pushing back on academics who have never pastored a church. If you're pastoring a church every Sunday, you can't be speaking truth to power. You've got to care for the people that God has entrusted to your care. You've got to care for them and instruct them about the gospel, how to live together as God's children, how to sort of live this out in a very, very practical way. And that. Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I just threw it back because that is key words. Yeah, you say key words, they'll block that video.
Those algorithms.
Yeah.
Yeah, those algorithms, they're bare.
Yeah.
There's preaching that attends to matters of worship. It's the preaching that holds before the people the holiness of God. God does not accept all forms of worship. There is a responsible and appropriate way to approach what is holy. There is the profane. And so there is a dimension of preaching where you attend to matters of the holy. But then there's also the prophetic, where you are attending to the social, the political, cultural, environmental, these broader issues. So in seminars, I actually get pastors to map their sermons and to be able to identify, let's think about your preaching for the past 2 months or the past 3 months. How many of your sermons are pastoral? How many are priestly? How many are prophetic? And the purpose of doing that kind of assessment work then helps them to see where the gaps are. Where are the places in the canon you're preaching from? What is that telling you? Where are the places in the canon you're not preaching from? And it's always a helpful way when they kind of see, oh, okay, yeah, I'm doing a lot of pastoral, and I'm doing some social justice prophetic. I'm not doing anything priestly, or they may be doing, if you're in a Pentecostal or holiness, they're doing a lot of priestly stuff. But then when it's time to do this broader work, they're not doing it. So it's a model that just kind of helps them to wrap their head around their preaching program. And now I'm continuing to develop a model, because this is particularly related to the third area, because of my focus on the work that we need to do in the public square, how to attend to preaching and the work of ministry that is going to encourage moral imagination. I mean, how do we how do we preach in a way where we inspire the moral imagination of this nation to imagine a world better than this? How do we help them to see what that world looks like? Because if they can't see it, if they cannot imagine it, then they'll never have the courage to work for it. So how in our preaching are we attending to matters of moral imagination, moral courage? There's a lot of silence, there's a lot of cowardice, there's a lot of folks looking the other way, a lot of folks with their heads in the sand. How do we preach so that Bishop Dickerson is encouraged? Keep having courage, because what he's doing, it's not easy. Doesn't have a lot of company either. So the easy thing would be is to say, yeah, I'm good with this. But to attend to moral courage that then takes us to the moral intelligence. How do we actually implement this in our congregations, our denominations, our judicatories, and at the public policy level? It requires a different kind. It's not just know-how, it's moral intelligence. How do you do that with people who don't necessarily agree? That's, learning how to draw on the wisdom tradition from Scripture. from a pastoral standpoint, how to nurture people into change. People don't change overnight. I didn't change overnight. So it takes moral intelligence to understand, okay, this is where you are. Let me get to know you. Because if I can get to know you a little bit better, God can help me to find a path to get you. If I can get you here, right here, maybe right here, somebody else is going to come along and they'll get right here. It's a lot different from where they were. And so, how do we in our preaching, how do we in our teaching, in our writing, in our advocacy, how are we moving people to imagine, to stand for, and to make possible a better world? And so this has been a lot of the work I have been doing in my busy past few years of writing, as you can see. If you see an article up on the screen that says Christian Ethics Today, you can find that online, right from their website. My last two op-eds in the Courier Journal, Pat picked up in Christian Ethics Today. These op-eds were other newspapers across the country were picking them up, especially my article entitled The Fight for the Soul of America. I want to encourage you to take a look at both of those articles. Those are about this hard work we have to do in the public square. And the America's not ready for the next crisis. I end that piece talking about 5 lessons the COVID pandemic taught us. And with that said, please be on the lookout. Keep your eye out for our, we're going to have a flourish course. It'll be a 5-week course. Pass that around. It'll be an online course where you can take it on your own or with a study group in your church that's very much talking about this fight that we are in for the soul of America. Any questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And in the model I'm developing, it's not thinking about morality individually. It's about our common good. So there are other folks doing work around individual piety and stuff like that. That's really not my concern. My concern is the public square, our life together. How do we build a society where we can live together in peace? And what is my responsibility as a Christian leader to be a part of that work? To me, that work is a part of my calling, but that's a particular kind of work to be doing in the public square, because I'm not there to convert everybody, for everybody to join my church. I'm just saying, no, how do we share all these resources God has put in the earth? Because God lets it rain on everyone. God loves everyone. So this is a way of how to think of morality in terms of just our common good. How do we stop killing each other? How do we prevent lots of people from starving to death? I'm just talking about big, basic things. Somebody else can get down into the weeds on individual morality. Let's stop people from starving to death. The darker your skin, having a different, more harsher sentence than the same person who committed the same crime with a different skin tone. No, I don't think that's pretty easy. Let's fix that. Big things.
And I guess that's what
Yeah.
is that people use thought to work. When you're free
Yeah.
and come in contact with comfort.
Yep. It really is.
But you're right, the goal is, come on, how can we work together? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. People are starving to death. Like, yeah, let's